There are moments in the natural world that don't announce themselves. They arrive without ceremony, without warning, and by the time you understand what you've just witnessed, it's already over. This was one of those moments. The mountains in this part of the region rise steeply from the valley floor, their faces cut by narrow paths of weathered stone, paths that hikers use at dawn, before the heat settles in, before the day becomes ordinary. On most mornings there is nothing up here but wind and birdsong and the slow, indifferent turning of the world. But on this particular morning something else was present, something that did not belong to the mountain at all. She had been kept in captivity. For how long no one could say with certainty, but the signs were there, in the way she held herself, in the flatness behind her eyes when she looked out at a world she had not been permitted to move freely through in a very long time. Civets are not domestic creatures. They are not built for cages or concrete or the particular cruelty of being owned. They are animals of the in-between, of dusk and dense vegetation, of canopy and shadow, of paths only they can navigate. To hold one is to hold something that was never yours to begin with. She had her young with her. That detail matters more than almost anything else that follows. They were small, impossibly small, and they stayed close to her with the single-minded urgency that only very young animals possess, that absolute biological faith that the creature nearest to them is the safest place on earth. They didn't understand the mountain. They didn't understand the man. They understood only her. The scent of her, the warmth of her, the rhythm of her breathing, which was probably the first sound any of them had ever known. The man walked to the edge. There are no adequate words for what happened next, not because it was dramatic in the cinematic sense. There was no shouting, no struggle, no dramatic confrontation. That, in some ways, is the most difficult thing to sit with. It was quiet. It happened the way a great many terrible things happen, quickly, casually, in silence, with the mountains watching and saying nothing. She didn't fight him. That is the thing that stays with you long after everything else fades. She didn't scratch, didn't writhe, didn't make any of the frantic movements you would expect from an animal facing the end. Some people who know civets, who have studied them, who have spent real time in their presence might tell you that what she did was something closer to awareness, an animal's version of reading a situation and understanding on some deep and wordless level that resistance would cost more than it was worth. But there was one more thing. Before the end of that moment, in the half-second before everything changed, she turned her head, not toward the man, not toward the drop. She turned back, toward the tiny shapes clustered a few feet away on the stone path, watching her with their small, dark, uncomprehending eyes, waiting for her to come back to them, the way she always had, the way they had no reason to believe she wouldn't. She looked at them, and then she was gone. The drop was deep. The kind of depth that swallows sound, the kind of terrain, broken rock, steep scree, dense undergrowth far below, that doesn't offer much in the way of survival odds. The man left. The mountain returned to silence, but the babies didn't move. This is the part of the story that is almost unbearable to consider, and also the part that tells you everything you need to know about what kind of bond had existed between them. They stayed at the edge, not in a panicked, searching way, not running back and forth, not scattering into the brush the way young animals sometimes do when overwhelmed. They stayed still, quiet, oriented toward the place she had disappeared from, as if stillness itself was a kind of waiting, as if the world they knew had not yet fully registered that she was gone, and so they simply waited. The mountain was silent around them, no movement from below, no sound rising up from the dark throat of the ravine, just the wind moving through the rocks, and the small shapes of the young civets clustered together at the lip of a drop they were too small and too young to fully understand, but old enough already to grieve. Whatever the man believed he had ended that morning, he was wrong, because the story, their story, was not over. It had, in the strangest and most improbable of ways, barely begun. He almost didn't stop. That's the honest truth of it. The hiker had been moving at a steady pace since early morning, head down, focused on the path, the way most people move through the world when they've decided they're simply passing through and not paying attention. The mountains had been quiet, unremarkable, just another dawn walk on a route he had taken before. Then he heard it. It wasn't loud. It wasn't the kind of sound that demands your attention from a distance. It was small, thin and high and oddly persistent, and it came from somewhere just ahead, near a bend in the path where the rock face opened up and the drop fell away to the left. He slowed, stopped, listened. The sound came again. He found them a moment later, 3 of them, maybe 4, pressed together on the bare stone near the edge of the cliff, so still they might have been mistaken for shadows if they hadn't been making that sound, that small, continuous, unanswered sound. He didn't know much about civets. He recognized them in the vague way most people recognize an animal, enough to know they weren't domestic, enough to know they were very young, enough to know that something was wrong. They didn't run from him. That was the first thing that struck him. Wild animals, especially young ones startled by a stranger, run. It is their most basic instruction, written into them before anything else. But these didn't. They looked at him with the dull, exhausted eyes of creatures who had already been through something, and then they turned back toward the edge. Again, the way they kept returning to that specific spot, not wandering, not searching the wider mountainside, but returning precisely to that one point, told him something before he was fully ready to understand it. He looked over the edge. The drop was severe. Broken rock, a tangle of vegetation far below, shadow and silence where the light hadn't reached yet. He could see nothing from up here, but the babies kept returning to this spot, and he had learned enough from a lifetime of paying attention to know that animals don't grieve directions. They grieve presences. Something had gone over that edge, and the way these small creatures were behaving, the stillness, the waiting, the refusal to leave, suggested, against all reasonable probability, that whatever had gone over might not be entirely gone. He stood at the edge for a long moment. Then he took out his phone, looked down into the dark, and made a decision that would change everything. I notice Act 3 is actually the only act we haven't written yet. Acts 1, 2, and 4 are all complete. I'll write Act 3 now to complete the full script. The descent was not heroic. That is worth saying plainly, because what followed was not a movie. There was no soundtrack, no dramatic lighting shift, no moment where the outcome felt assured. There was only a man making his way down a steep and unstable cliff face, one careful movement at a time, in the cool and indifferent silence of a mountain morning. The rock was loose in places, his boots slipped twice. He pressed himself flat against the cliff face and waited, both times for his breathing to steady before continuing. Below him the ravine deepened, darker, cooler, the light thinning as the walls closed in around him. The sounds of the path above disappeared entirely. Down here the world was reduced to stone and shadow and the careful placement of hands and feet. He scanned as he moved, listening between each step. Nothing. Then, a sound, low and irregular, not the wind. He stopped. It came again, faint and shallow, from somewhere beneath a jutting overhang to his left, half hidden by a tangle of undergrowth. He moved toward it slowly, the way you move toward something fragile, something that fear could still take away. She was lying on her side on damp stone, breathing, but barely. Eyes open, fixed on nothing in particular, the unfocused gaze of a creature that has spent everything it had just staying alive. Her fur was matted and dirty from the fall. One hind leg held at an angle that suggested damage, but her ribcage rose and fell, slowly, steadily. The most important movement in the world, happening quietly in the dark at the bottom of a ravine where no one had thought to look. He crouched. He did not rush. He gave her time to register his presence, let her read him, let her make whatever assessment she was still capable of making. And then with both hands open he reached forward. She didn't pull away. Whether that was trust or exhaustion or simply nothing left to spend on resistance, he couldn't know. What he knew was that she allowed it. He lifted her against his chest. She was lighter than he expected. That fact stayed with him. The specific, quiet devastation of how little she weighed as he began the long climb back up. Above him, still out of sight, 3 small animals were waiting on a cold stone path. He climbed toward them, one hand hold at a time. He came up slowly. There is no other way to do it when you are carrying something fragile, something that has already survived more than it should have had to. One hand on the rock face, one arm cradling her against his chest, his breath coming in ragged pulls from the effort of the climb and the weight of what he was bringing back. The sun had shifted by now. What had started as an early morning had become something else entirely, something longer, heavier, harder to name. At the top the babies were still there. Of course they were. They hadn't moved from that spot in all the hours he had been gone. The stone beneath them was cold. The wind had picked up, and still they had stayed, small and patient and absolutely certain, in the way that only very young creatures can be certain, that waiting was the right thing to do. He set her down gently, a few feet from the edge, away from the drop that had taken her and somehow, impossibly, given her back. For a moment nothing happened. She lay still, breathing, visibly, carefully breathing, but not yet moving, not yet fully present in the way she had been before the fall. Her body had been through something that bodies aren't designed to survive, and the return to the world was slow and uncertain and quiet. Then one of the babies moved toward her. Not rushing, not the frantic, tumbling scramble you might expect, just a slow, deliberate crossing of the few feet between them, nose forward, reading the air, checking, making sure. And when the distance finally closed, when small nose met warm fur, something in the young animal's posture changed completely. The tension that had been held in that tiny body for hours simply released, the way a breath releases when you've been holding it far too long. The others followed. She raised her head. It was a small movement, almost nothing, measured against everything that had happened, but she raised her head and she acknowledged them, not dramatically, not with the full energy she didn't yet have, but with the quiet, unmistakable certainty of a mother who knows her own. The mountains didn't mark the moment, the wind didn't stop, the world continued exactly as it had before, but something had been returned to it that morning, something that cruelty had tried to erase and failed, because it had underestimated the one thing no fall, no matter how deep, could touch.